Quebec, a metal warehouse. A row of giant white barrels, each one holding liquid gold. A government inspector climbs a ladder and knocks on one of them. That is the problem. It is empty. He knocks the next one. Empty. Third one. Empty. By the time he is done checking the rest, he realizes something impossible. More than 9,000 barrels of maple syrup worth tens of millions of dollars have vanished. A crime scene with no footprints, no break-in, no forced doors, just syrup missing from the inside. This is the story of how a group of thieves pulled off one of the strangest, most carefully planned, and honestly, most Canadian crimes in modern history. The Great Maple Syrup Heist. To understand how this heist even happened, you need to know one thing. In Quebec, maple syrup is not just food. It is an industry controlled like oil. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers controls how much syrup is produced, how much is stored, and how much can be sold. Imagine OPEC, but sticky. To stabilize the global market, the Federation maintains a massive supply known as the Global Strategic Maple Syrup Reserve, a giant stockpile stored across several warehouses in rural Quebec. This reserve holds up to half of the entire world's supply of maple syrup, and that reserve is exactly where the thieves struck. The barrels that the inspector knocked on were not locked, not sealed, and not guarded. They were stacked from the floor to the ceiling in a remote warehouse on Route 226 in St. Louis de Blanford. Why? Because nobody believed anyone would steal maple syrup. It sounds ridiculous, but that is the point. The perfect crime is the one nobody thinks is possible. Barrels sat 3 high, white, identical, and unmonitored. Each one weighed over 300 kilograms when full. But inside those barrels was wealth, real wealth. The Federation stored millions of liters there. And in the year 2011, for a group of men who knew the system better than anyone else, temptation turned into opportunity. Richard Valliere was not a thief in the traditional sense. He did not break into buildings or crack safes. He was a hustler, a black market dealer, and a man who knew the maple syrup economy inside and out. For years, he had been skirting Federation rules, buying and selling syrup off the books. There was demand for unregulated syrup, cheaper, faster, and with no government oversight. But he needed supply, and that supply was sitting inside thousands of barrels in a warehouse with almost zero security. Vallières had ambition. He just needed someone on the inside. That is when he met Avec Caron, a man with a key and a plan. Avec Caron was a businessman who leased one of the Federation's storage warehouses. He had access. He had freedom. He had the trust of the organization that stored millions of dollars in inventory right under his nose. But he also had debts, pressure, and a side of his life that was not as tidy as his business license suggested. When Vallières approached him, the idea was not, "Let us steal a little syrup." It was, "What if we took enough to change our lives?" Karen knew something the Federation did not. The warehouse was not checked often. Security was minimal. The barrels were not monitored individually. And no one kept track of exact quantities in real time. So the men came up with a plan so absurd that it almost felt like a prank. Instead of stealing barrels, they would drain the syrup, fill the barrels with water to keep the weight the same, and quietly move the stolen liquid out of the building. It was bold. It was simple. And it would take months, which was exactly what made it work. Summer of 2011. Inside the warehouse, everything operated the same as always, except for one small detail. Karen occasionally allowed trucks, unregistered and unofficial, to roll inside the building. Workers hired under the table climbed the stacked barrels. They opened the lids, They pumped syrup into waiting barrels, containers, and sometimes even their own vehicles. They worked at night. They worked during the day, whenever no one was watching. They acted like they belonged because, technically, they did. The syrup was moved quietly from the warehouse to a nearby operation where it could be repackaged. There, the thieves applied fake stickers from small producers to disguise the true origin. It was hidden in plain sight, sold as if it came from local farms. The Federation never noticed because everything looked normal from the outside. The barrels still sat in their original places. They still weighed the same. The warehouse still operated. No alarms, no suspicious activity, nothing missing. Yet, what started as a few barrels quickly turned into much more. Every trip out of the warehouse was another chance to expand. And Vallières did not want a little money. He wanted all of it. The group siphoned maple syrup steadily, week after week, month after month. By the time they were done, they had stolen 5.6 million liters, more than 9,500 barrels. Street value, more than 18 million US dollars at the time. This was not a side hustle. This was an industrial operation, the largest theft of maple syrup in human history. But like all heists, it could not stay hidden forever. The thieves became greedy. They began selling syrup faster and in larger quantities across the border into the United States. Buyers noticed. Prices dropped unexpectedly. Supply suddenly increased. The Federation suspected foul play, but they had no idea of the scale. Then, in late 2012, they scheduled a routine inventory inspection. To the thieves, that should have been the moment to panic, but it did not happen, because they did not even know the inspection was coming. They were not tracking it. The Federation did inspections occasionally, but inconsistently. The thieves became comfortable, too comfortable, which leads to the moment everything fell apart. An inspector climbed up the barrels to take his usual weight measurement. He nearly fell. A full barrel weighs more than 600 pounds. An empty one weighs barely 80. The barrel tipped over, almost throwing him to the floor. Confused, he knocked on the side. No syrup, just emptiness. He ordered more barrels checked, then entire rows, then whole sections. Panic rippled through the warehouse. The Federation realized the impossible. Someone had been stealing their reserve for months, maybe even a year, right out from under them. This was not a small theft. It was not a few rogue barrels. It was a catastrophe, a global shortage waiting to happen. And now, the hunt began. Quebec police launched a massive operation called Operation Sugar Shack. Officers traced every suspicious shipment. They demanded invoices. They examined trucking logs, border crossings, and financial records. The scale was overwhelming, but one clue stood out. Some barrels of local syrup were appearing in Vermont and New Brunswick with suspiciously high volumes. The buyers had no idea they were part of a crime. They unknowingly connected detectives to the black market network. And there, at the center of it, was Vallières, the man who bought and sold more syrup in 1 year than most producers could make in 5. Authorities raided his home, his warehouse, and his trucks. They found barrels, invoices, cash, and a trail leading directly back to the strategic reserve. In total, police arrested 26 people. Vallières was charged as the mastermind. Caron was arrested for providing access. Middlemen and transport workers were caught in the dragnet. The story exploded in the media. The world laughed. Late-night shows mocked it. Headlines called it the stickiest heist ever. Americans joked that only Canadians could create a crime this polite. But the Federation was not laughing. They were missing tens of millions of dollars in product and wanted justice. Villiers claimed he had sold the syrup but barely kept anything. He said he was just the middleman. The courts disagreed. He was convicted of theft, fraud, and trafficking stolen syrup, and he was ordered to pay $9 million in restitution. Here is the part documentaries often skip. Most of the men involved were not hardened criminals. They were farmers, truck drivers, and local workers. People frustrated by a system they felt controlled them unfairly. To them, the Federation was not a protector. It was a cartel that limited their income. Some saw the heist not as theft, but as rebellion, a way to break the monopoly. This does not justify the crime, but it explains why so many people joined it quietly, and why the operation could grow so fast without anyone talking. It was about money, yes, but it was also about resentment and opportunity. After the arrests, the Federation tightened its security drastically. Barrels were moved to monitored facilities. Digital tracking was introduced. Producers were required to provide more documentation. But here is the twist. New evidence suggests the stolen syrup may have permanently altered the global market. How? Because some of the unregulated syrup sold during the heist ended up mixing into the legitimate supply chain. It changed international pricing. It expanded markets that were not supposed to exist. It created new buyers who preferred cheaper, gray market syrup. In other words, the heist did not just steal syrup. It changed the economics of the entire industry. Even today, the Federation admits they never recovered all the syrup, and likely never will. The black market syrup flowed too far, too fast, and too quietly. Here is something almost nobody knows. When investigators confronted Villiers, he claimed he could not repay the millions in restitution because he had not kept the profits. But later testimony revealed something surprising. He admitted he made many millions, but then he said he spent it. On what? Luxury items? Hidden bank accounts? Expensive property? No. He claimed he used the money to pay previous debts from other illegal syrup deals, years before the heist even happened. In other words, the man at the center of one of the biggest thefts in Canadian history may have ended up with almost nothing. A multi-million-dollar crime that made international headlines might not have made its mastermind rich. That irony, that bleak punchline, is the kind of detail that makes this story unforgettable. The maple syrup heist is more than a quirky headline. It is a collision of opportunity, resentment, loopholes, and a surprisingly valuable commodity. A warehouse, stacks of barrels, a missing ocean of syrup, a crime so absurd that it almost feels fake until you see the numbers. Millions stolen, dozens arrested, a market disrupted, a country embarrassed. Today, the strategic maple syrup reserve is guarded like a treasury, with locks, cameras, and audits. The joke ended, but the story remains. A reminder that sometimes the most unbelievable crimes are the ones hiding in plain sight, and that even in the most peaceful places, the sweetest things can be worth stealing.